Throughout the Pacific Ocean are scattered many thousands of islands, some no more than tiny piles of rock, and others large masses of land many thousands of square miles in size. During the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, some of the more powerful nations of the world took over many of these islands to use as naval and military bases, places where warships could safely go for needed fuel, supplies, and fresh water, and to make repairs, where troops could be brought together, equipped, armed, and put on ships that would take them where they were needed to fight, and, by the 1930s, where airplanes could take off and land, and be armed and fueled for bombing attacks on enemy ships and bases. Generals, admirals, and politicians of the nations that had bases in the Pacific all knew that if war ever broke out there, it would be fought over the bases. It would be a war in which fleets of warships would be used to protect their own bases and to land, troops to take over enemy bases. The side that could inflict the most destruction on the enemy's warships and could take over the most of the enemy's bases would win. In the year 1941, the United States, the Empire of Japan, Great Britain, and the Netherlands all had numbers of bases and possessions throughout the Pacific area. The United States bases included some of the Aleutian Islands, off the tip of Alaska, Wake Island and tiny Midway Island in the Central Pacific, the Philippine Islands and Guam in the Southwest Pacific, and others. The biggest and most important American naval base was on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, the base called Pearl Harbor. At 10 minutes to 8 o'clock on the morning of December 7, 1941, the sky over Pearl Harbor was bright, clear, and empty. In the harbor, a large part of the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet lay peacefully at anchor, 8 big battleships, 8 cruisers, 29 destroyers, and more than a score of various other ships. They were an imposing sight, advertising the might of one of the world's greatest sea powers. Suddenly, clusters of dots appeared in the bright sky, dots that grew swiftly into low-flying airplanes rushing toward the island. In moments, the air was vibrating with the thunder of many motors as the formations of planes swept over Oahu. Startled eyes looked up from the ships and the shore and saw that the planes now fanning out over the harbor and island bore on their sides and wings the round red ball that was the rising sun symbol of the Empire of Japan. There was a sudden, startling crrr-rump of an exploding bomb. Pearl Harbor was being attacked. That surprise attack, which marked the beginning of 1,336 days of war between the United States and Japan in the Pacific Ocean, was a great success for the Japanese military forces. When the last of the planes went speeding back to their aircraft carriers lying far out at sea, the American fleet was lying under a shroud of smoke, badly crippled. Bombs had sunk 3 of the battleships, turned another one over, and seriously damaged the other 4. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers were also damaged. More than 260 airplanes had been destroyed, and more than 3,000 men of the Navy, Marine Corps, and Army were dead. Luckily for the Americans, the fleet's 3 aircraft carriers, together with a number of other ships, were safely out at sea during the attack, and so escaped damage, but the loss of the battleships in the harbor was a shattering blow that meant the United States would begin the war at a serious disadvantage. The United States Navy had long had plans for what to do in case war broke out in the Pacific, but now those plans would have to be changed. American strategy had called for large forces that included many battleships to seize certain Japanese bases and to go quickly to the aid of British naval forces in the southwest. But the loss of so many battleships at Pearl Harbor made this impossible. The American fleet could not go on the attack now, could not be risked on any long-range missions. The ships that were left would have to be kept back and used only in defense. The Japanese, too, had long had plans for a war in the Pacific, and it was those plans they were now following. Their first goal had been to damage as badly as possible the United States Pacific Fleet, which was the only naval force in the Pacific strong enough to cause them any trouble. Most of the powerful British fleet was in the Atlantic, engaged in the life-or-death struggle against Nazi Germany. The first part of the plan had been carried out with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Another objective was the quick capture of the rich oil fields in British Malaya and the Dutch Netherlands East Indies, for the Japanese Empire had no other way of getting the oil and gasoline it so desperately needed. At the same time, Japanese forces would seize many bases to form a defensive ring around their conquests. They would then use these bases to smash any moves against them by the Allies Americans, British, Australians and Dutch. the Japanese moved swiftly to carry out their plans. 10 hours after Pearl Harbor was attacked, Japanese bombers winging from a base on the island of Formosa, present-day Taiwan, struck at the big, important United States Army Air Corps base of Clark Field on the Philippine island of Luzon and destroyed the majority of the American planes there. Almost at the same moment, Japanese forces invaded British Malaya and moved into the nation of Thailand, lying just next to the British colony of Burma. On December 10, with no American aircraft left to hinder them, Japanese ships began landing troops in the Philippines. On the same day, some 6,000 Japanese troops swarmed onto the American island base of Guam and quickly captured it from the tiny force of United States Marines and Guamanian police who tried to defend it. And on the same day still, Japanese bombers located the only 2 British battleships in the Pacific, which were hurrying to try to stop the landings on Malaya, and sank them. The Allies now had no battleships in the Pacific. The Japanese had 11. On December 11th, the governments of Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. This was done because Germany and Italy, allies against Great Britain and Russia in the war going on in Europe and North Africa, had an alliance with Japan and were pledged to support it if it went to war. The German and Italian leaders were delighted to see Japan go to war against their enemy Great Britain and were more than willing to go to war themselves against the United States, which had been doing all it could to help Great Britain and Russia, sending them supplies by sea. So the United States, with its crippled Pacific fleet, now found itself in 2 wars, and the war in the Pacific, which had begun so disastrously, continued that way. In the last 3 weeks of 1941 and the first few months of 1942, the Japanese Army and Navy continued to strike like a whirlwind at America and its friends in the Pacific. After a long, heroic struggle by the United States Marines defending it, the naval base of Wake Island was captured. The important British base of Hong Kong, on the coast of China, was captured. The Australian-controlled islands of New Britain were invaded, and the big, important port of Rabaul fell into Japanese hands, becoming Japan's main naval and air base in the southwest Pacific. A powerful Japanese force moved into the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, a mass of many thousands of big and little islands lying scattered between Australia and the southern tip of Asia. By the beginning of March, this entire area was captured, giving Japan control of vital oil fields, together with many bases from which to make attacks on Australia. Moving up out of Thailand, a Japanese army invaded Burma and pushed toward the border of India. In Malaya, British forces were pushed down into the island stronghold of Singapore at the southern tip. On February 8th, the Japanese stormed into Singapore, and within a week it had surrendered. 70,000 British soldiers became prisoners of war, and in the Philippines the American forces were being pushed back and back. The Japanese did not go entirely unpunished. In January, the American aircraft carrier Yorktown, which had been in the Atlantic, came around through the Panama Canal and joined the Pacific Fleet. With the 4 carriers and the undamaged cruisers and destroyers available, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, put together small fleets known as task forces and sent them out to cautiously do what damage they could. In late February, a task force headed by the carrier Enterprise, commanded by Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, launched a bombing attack on the Japanese troops that had taken over Wake Island. On March 10th, a task force containing the carriers Lexington and Yorktown bombed Japanese bases in New Guinea, sinking and damaging a number of small ships. But these were tiny nuisance raids that were hardly even heard of by the American people. On the other hand, the sweeping victories of the Japanese had made Americans grim and disheartened. It seemed as if America's Pacific enemy was unbeatable. On the West Coast, many people feared that a Japanese invasion might be made at any moment. However, the Japanese war leaders, the generals and admirals who made the plans for how the war would be fought, had no thought at all of ever trying to invade and conquer the United States. The basis of their plans had been to knock out the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor and then to quickly capture so much territory that the United States would realize it would take a tremendous effort to get it all back, and faced with fighting another war in Europe, which many American politicians regarded as far more important than the one in the Pacific, would finally just drop out of the Pacific War in a year or so, letting the Japanese keep all their conquests. Most of the Japanese leaders felt that if the war dragged on for much more than 2 years, their chances of losing it would grow, because the vast industrial power of the United States could turn out far more ships, planes, tanks, and weapons over a long period of time than Japanese industry could. Japan's only hope for keeping all its conquests, many of which were vital to its national economy, was to make the United States drop out of the war in the Pacific as quickly as possible. As far as the war in Europe and the fate of their German and Italian allies were concerned, the Japanese really did not care. But despite all their successes in the first few months of the war, the Japanese had not quite accomplished everything they needed to accomplish, for they had not damaged the American fleet as badly as they had hoped to. It was still able to cause them some trouble, as it had shown with those nuisance raids, and as long as it still existed, it gave the American people confidence. But if most of what remained of it could be wiped out, so that the United States would have virtually no defense against attacks on Hawaii or even on the American West Coast, most Japanese leaders believed that would be enough to make the Americans want to quit and try to make peace. Therefore, it seemed obvious that the remaining American fleet had to be dealt a death blow. The commander-in-chief of the Japanese fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had a plan to bring that about. His plan was simply to trick the remaining American warships into going to a place where they could be attacked and destroyed by a much larger number of Japanese ships lying in wait for them. Yamamoto felt he could make the Americans come where he wanted them by capturing something they would absolutely have to try to get back one of their most important bases, Midway Island. Midway is what is called an atoll, a ring-shaped island formed of stony coral, with a sort of small lake of seawater called a lagoon in the middle of it. Midway Atoll is a partial ring of coral reef, about 6 miles across, with a pair of tiny islands of dazzling white coral sand forming part of the ring. It lies almost exactly midway between Japan and the American West Coast, and the United States had turned it into a valuable naval base in the years before the war began. Huge stores of fuel and supplies were kept on Midway's islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, and United States Navy ships, especially submarines, could sail in and drop anchor in the lagoon, take on fuel and supplies, and sail out again to attack Japanese warships. From airfields on the islands, planes flew out hundreds of miles over the ocean each day to spy out Japanese ship movements. Thus, in American hands, Midway was a threat to Japan, but in Japanese hands it would be a worse threat to the United States, for it could become a base from which attacks on Hawaii and even on the American West Coast could easily be made. If Midway were taken by the Japanese, Admiral Yamamoto felt sure the Americans would have no choice but to send what was left of their fleet to try to recapture it. Admiral Yamamoto's plan called for a huge, powerful naval force to head secretly for Midway, while a smaller force sailed northward and attacked American bases in the Aleutian Islands, to draw the attention of the American naval commanders there. Then, part of the fleet that sailed to Midway would launch a surprise air attack on the base to soften it up, and another part of the fleet would quickly land troops to wipe out the defenders and take over. The main portion of the Japanese force would lie back in hiding until the American ships came rushing to Midway's aid, and then the Japanese would close in and destroy the badly outnumbered Americans. But not all the other Japanese military leaders would agree to Yamamoto's plan. Admiral Osamu Nagano, the chief of the Navy's general staff, whose main job it was to work out details of battle plans, wanted to make an invasion of Australia rather than Midway, fearing that Midway might not be important enough to bring the American ships into a trap. However, the army generals objected to Nagano's idea, pointing out that they simply did not have enough troops for such a gigantic operation. Nagano then offered a plan to invade Fiji, the huge island just north of Australia, and to capture Samoa, a cluster of 16 islands in the South Pacific, less than 5,000 miles from the American West Coast, where the United States had another important naval base. But Yamamoto refused to consider this, and continued to insist on his own plan. For a time, the Japanese High Command could not reach agreement. Then, something happened that shocked the Japanese and thrilled the American people and their allies. On April 18, 1942, the Japanese capital, Tokyo, and nearby cities of Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe were bombed by 16 United States Army B-25 bombers. The aircraft came roaring over Japan in broad daylight, catching fighter plane defenders and anti-aircraft guns by surprise. The planes unloaded bombs that started fires and damaged steel plants and ammunition factories, and then sped away over Japan. Some of them later landed safely in China, an American ally. One came down in Russia, another ally. Several crashed. It seemed impossible. These bombers had only what was called a 600-mile range, meaning they could carry only enough fuel to travel 600 miles from where they took off, and then turn and fly the 600 miles back, or a total of 1,200 miles one way. Thus, the B-25s must have taken off from somewhere that was within at least 1,200 miles of Japan, except that the United States did not have any bases that close. When President Roosevelt announced the bombing attack to the American people, he said only that the bombers had flown from Shangri-La. But this meant nothing, for Shangri-La was simply the made-up name of a mysterious hidden city in a book of fiction by an English writer. There was no such place. Actually, the bombers had taken off from the deck of the United States aircraft carrier Hornet, which had sailed to within 700 miles of Japan. No one even considered that such huge planes, which generally needed a long strip of land from which to take off, could possibly have used the deck of a carrier. But the bomber crews, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James H. Jimmy Doolittle, had trained until they were able to get off an aircraft carrier flight deck safely. The bombings did not do a great deal of damage and were really just another nuisance raid. But they greatly cheered up the American people, who had not had much to be cheerful about up to now, and they frightened and enraged the Japanese, for whom the bombing of their homeland was a dreadful insult and humiliation. The Japanese leaders were so furious that when a few of the American bomber crewmen were captured, instead of having them all made prisoners of war, according to international law, the men were put on trial as war criminals, and several of them were executed. The American bombing raid brought the Japanese high command to agreement. It seemed to the generals and admirals that there was only one possible place from which the bombers could have taken off, and that was Midway, which was just 2,300 miles from Tokyo. Perhaps the bombers had carried extra fuel somehow to enable them to make such a long flight, but at any rate, the danger of any more such raids had to be eliminated. Midway had to be captured. There was agreement that Admiral Yamamoto's plan should be carried out. And now there took place another event that strengthened the belief of the Japanese leaders that the American fleet had to be wiped out. On the 3rd of May, a Japanese force moved into the Solomon Islands, a chain of islands near the northwestern part of Australia, and landed troops on the islands of Tulagi and Florida Island. Then, the force of warships, which included 2 aircraft carriers and troop transports, moved out of the Solomons into a stretch of water known as the Coral Sea, on the way to make an invasion of Port Moresby, an extremely important Allied base on the big island of Papua New Guinea, very close to Australia. But in the Coral Sea, the Japanese met one of Admiral Nimitz's troublesome task forces, and a major battle took place, the Battle of the Coral Sea. While the Americans lost Lexington, one of their only 4 carriers in the Pacific, plus an oil tanker and a destroyer, the Japanese lost only a light aircraft carrier and a few other ships. But the Japanese had to turn back and give up the Port Moresby invasion. Clearly, the American warships that remained were a threat that had to be eliminated. So, on May 5th, Admiral Yamamoto's plan was accepted by all the other war leaders, and the build-up of the attack force began. Huge amounts of food, fuel, and other supplies were collected at the bases from which various parts of the force would sail. The troops that were to land on the 2 little islands at Midway and the pilots who would make the softening up air raid began to train in secret. The ships that were to take part were supplied and fueled, while their crews were brought up to full strength. The admirals who would command the various parts of the force held frequent secret meetings to check and recheck their plans. The different parts of the attack force sailed from Japan and the islands of Guam and Saipan between May 26th and May 28th. Altogether, they formed the biggest war fleet ever seen in the Pacific Ocean. There were 4 of Japan's biggest, fastest aircraft carriers, 2 light carriers, 2 seaplane carriers, 7 battleships, 13 cruisers, some 40 destroyers, about 16 submarines, and a large number of supply and troop transport ships. As the ships headed out to sea, they rocked with the noise of cheering and the wild singing of patriotic songs. The Japanese sailors felt they were on the way to a tremendous victory that would literally knock their enemy out of the war. The success of Admiral Yamamoto's plan depended mainly on secrecy and surprise. But unfortunately for the Japanese, they could not keep their preparations secret, and thus they were unable to take the Americans by surprise. The Japanese did not know that the secret code they used in sending radio messages to ships, planes, and troop commanders was not secret. The Americans had pretty well figured it out. But the Japanese continued to use it, with the result that many supposedly secret messages dealing with the build-up of the Midway attack force were intercepted by American ship and shore radios and decoded by American naval intelligence officers, whose job it was to find out what the enemy was going to do. Reports were also coming in from American submarines patrolling near the places where the Japanese ships were assembling, and from other sources. Thus, by the middle of May, Admiral Nimitz not only knew what the Japanese were planning, but also had a good idea of how many and what kinds of ships they would use. He even had a fair idea of when the attack would be made. Admiral Yamamoto had been right that the Americans would not let Midway fall into Japanese hands without risking everything they had to prevent it, and Admiral Nimitz began calling every available United States warship into Pearl Harbor to form a fleet to defend the vital base. The fleet that was finally put together seemed woefully small. To stand up to the huge attack force that he knew the Japanese were sending, Nimitz had only 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, 17 destroyers, and 25 submarines, together with a couple of fuel tankers. Actually, Nimitz did have a few more ships available, but he formed them into a tiny fleet to be sent to the Aleutians, just in case the Japanese pretend attack there turned out to be the main attack after all, which was what some American admirals feared. The United States fleet would be both outnumbered and outgunned, but it would have 2 advantages the Japanese would not be expecting to run into it, and it would have a lot of help from the planes based on Midway, which would be like a huge, unsinkable aircraft carrier. At any rate, outnumbered and outgunned or not, the little fleet was the best the United States Navy could do. It would have to do its best. Admiral Nimitz divided the Midway fleet into 2 parts that were given the names Task Force 16 and Task Force 17. Task Force 16 consisted of the aircraft carriers Hornet and Enterprise, plus 6 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 2 tankers. It was to be commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, who was sometimes known as the human machine, because he had a mind like a computer and never seemed to get excited. Task Force 17 consisted of the carrier Yorktown, with 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers, and would be commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who had been the commander at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Fletcher would actually be the man in charge of both task forces. The submarines, under the command of Rear Admiral Robert English, would be placed in a long patrol line where they could quickly report any sightings of the enemy force and do whatever damage possible with their torpedoes. Once the battle fleet was put together, Admiral Nimitz turned his attention to making Midway into a fortress. The base was already pretty well equipped to defend itself, with 6 big naval guns, a dozen anti-aircraft guns, almost 100 machine guns, a squadron of marine fighter planes and a squadron of scout bombers, and over 700 marines. But from about the 20th of May to the beginning of June, more weapons, planes and men were poured in to add to Midway's defences 16 marine dive bombers, 22 army bombers, and another half-dozen fighter planes, more anti-aircraft guns, more marines, and even 5 light tanks. Bomb-proof shelters were constructed, underwater mines were scattered all around the reef, and wild tangles of spiky barbed wire were strung on the reef and the island beaches. On May 28th, Task Force 16 quietly left Pearl Harbor, and Task Force 17 departed 2 days later, taking a slightly different course. On June 2nd, the 2 forces came together again at a spot in the ocean that had been designated Point Luck, about 325 miles northeast of Midway. There, they waited. Every day since May 30th, 22 big United States Navy PBY flying boats, known as Catalinas, had been flying patrols from Midway, searching the sea as far out as 700 miles in all directions from the base, watching for enemy ships. A little before 9 o'clock on the morning of June 3rd, Ensign Jack Reed, at the controls of a Catalina just about 700 miles southwest of Midway, leaned forward and peered through his binoculars at a distant point on the vast sheet of grey-green water spread out beyond his plane's nose. "Do you see what I see?" he asked his co-pilot. They both agreed on what they saw: 11 ships heading toward Midway at top speed. Ensign Reed sent a message to Midway that the Japanese were beginning to arrive. The commanders on Midway believed that the ships coming toward them were part of the Japanese main fleet, because Reed said he thought he saw battleships and cruisers among them. But Admiral Fletcher, who of course was being notified of everything that was happening, was not so sure. From what he had learned from naval intelligence reports on the Japanese plan, it seemed to him that the main Japanese force would not be coming straight from the southwest, as these ships were, but from the northwest. Fletcher thought about it for a while, then made a very important decision. He had the two task forces turn and sail toward where he felt the Japanese fleet would be coming from, the northwest. Admiral Fletcher was absolutely right. The Japanese ships that had been sighted were not part of the main fleet. They were just some of the transports bringing the Japanese Marines and soldiers who were supposed to land on Midway and capture it. The advance portion of Admiral Yamamoto's main fleet was approaching Midway from the northwest and was now only a few hundred miles distant. Thanks to Fletcher's decision, the American ships were heading straight for it. The advance portion of the Japanese main fleet was made up of 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, 12 destroyers, some tankers, and the 4 big aircraft carriers. The carriers were actually the backbone of this force, and the other ships were there mainly just to protect them. The planes on the carriers were to be launched in a tremendous bombing attack on Midway to knock out the defences so the troops coming from the southwest, on the transports, could land and take over the base with little or no trouble. Like the American carriers, the Japanese ships held 3 different kinds of planes, dive bombers, which swooped down on a target from a great height and dropped a single large bomb, torpedo planes, which came in low and straight at a target and launched a torpedo, and heavily armed fighter planes, whose job it was to protect the bombers and torpedo planes by shooting down any enemy aircraft that tried to attack them. For an attack on a land target such as Midway, both the dive bombers and torpedo planes would carry bombs, for torpedoes would not, of course, work on land. The 4 carriers, Akagi, Red Castle, Kaga, Increased Joy, Soryu, Green Dragon, and Hiryu, Flying Dragon, bore a total of 272 planes, which was about 40 more than the 3 American carriers could put into the sky. As the Japanese advance force sped toward Midway in the hours of early morning darkness on June 4th, its commanding officer, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor, was faintly worried. There were low, heavy rain clouds hanging thickly over this part of the ocean, and if they were still there by the time the planes were due to be launched, at about sunrise, it would make the launching and the entire attack far more difficult. But as the hours wore on, the clouds began to rise and visibility became somewhat better. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the planes that would make the attack on Midway were warming up on the carrier flight decks, and it looked as if conditions would be good enough. At 4:30, Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch the attack. As each plane roared along the deck and lifted into the lightening sky, the carrier crews flung up their arms and raised a great shout of gung-ho, or forever, meaning that the glory of the Empire of Japan would last forever. By sunup, a little before 5 o'clock, 108 Japanese warplanes were droning toward Midway. On Midway, between 4:15 a.m. and 4:30 a.m., 11 Catalinas had taken off, each heading for a different section of ocean on reconnaissance missions. They were flying high enough to be able to see a lot of ocean, but for those heading northwest, the thick clouds blocked most of the view of the water. However, at about 5:30 a.m., the pilot of one of the Catalinas found an opening in the clouds and nosed down through it. Within minutes, he and his crew spotted the Japanese carriers and saw the formations of planes winging off toward Midway. A radio message went flashing back to the atoll and to the American fleet: enemy carriers, many planes heading Midway. And a few minutes later, another Catalina also located the Japanese and radioed vital information. 2 carriers and battleships, bearing 320 degrees, distance 180, course 135, speed 25. Admiral Fletcher now knew exactly where his enemy was. He had sent a number of Yorktown's planes out on patrol that morning, and now had to wait for them to return before he could take Yorktown after the Japanese ships. But he ordered Admiral Spruance to take Task Force 16 toward the Japanese position and launch an attack, promising to bring Task Force 17 to join in as soon as all his planes were back. Soon, Spruance's 2 carriers and other ships were closing toward Nagumo's force at top speed. Meanwhile, on Midway, air raid sirens were howling, Marines were rushing to their battle stations, and every plane that could fly was getting into the air. 2 squadrons of Marine fighter planes were rising up to take on the incoming Japanese aircraft, while 2 flights of Marine bombers sped toward the enemy carriers, followed by half a dozen Navy torpedo planes and 4 Army B-26 high-level bombers. 30 miles out from Midway, the 12 planes of the 1st Marine Fighter Squadron that had taken off spotted the Japanese aircraft roaring toward them. The American planes climbed high, hoping to take their enemy by surprise, and swept down in screaming dives. 36 Japanese fighters swarmed up to meet them. A twisting, turning dogfight began, with planes suddenly blown apart in mid-air, falling in flames into the ocean below, gliding down crippled to crash land in the water. Not only did the Americans face 3-to-1 odds, but more than half of them were flying old model planes that were no match at all for the swifter, more agile Japanese Zero fighters. The badly outnumbered and outclassed Marines managed to knock out 2 Zeros, but the squadron was practically wiped out. Just outside the atoll, the Japanese were met by the 2nd Marine Fighter Squadron of 13 planes. Most of these Americans were also flying old Brewster Buffaloes, which were no match for the Zeros, and the result of this fight was the same as the first. Of the total of 25 American fighter planes that left Midway to attack the incoming Japanese aircraft, 17 were destroyed and 7 badly damaged. Only a few managed to make it back to the atoll after the Japanese attack ended. The Japanese bombers and torpedo planes roared in over Midway's 2 islands and were met by a hail of anti-aircraft and machine gun fire. The islands shuddered as dozens of 550-pound bombs struck with thunderous explosions. A cluster of fuel storage tanks erupted with a deafening whump, sending a coiling cloud of greasy black smoke rushing into the sky. A bomb slammed into the Blow powerhouse on Eastern Island. Another burst inside a big seaplane hangar, setting it afire. Others demolished the mess hall where the Marines had their meals, and the dispensary where they received medical care. But the sky was literally filled with streams of machine gun bullets and speckled with the black puffs of bursting anti-aircraft shells, and these were taking a toll of the raiders. A Japanese fighter had its wing sliced off by a spray of .50 caliber machine gun bullets and went cartwheeling into the sand. A bomber came spinning down out of the sky, trailing a plume of black smoke. Another bomber disintegrated in mid-air. The full-throated roar of airplane engines, the stutter of scores of machine guns, and the shattering KBLAM of 3-inch anti-aircraft guns mixed into an ear-splitting, mind-numbing din of violence. After 10 minutes of this terrible destruction on land and in the sky, the Japanese planes swung off and headed back out over the ocean. The atoll lay beneath an umbrella of smoke, and a dozen fires flickered among the shattered buildings. But thanks to the advance warning and days of preparation, the number of dead and injured was surprisingly small. The precious runways on which planes could land and take off were still in good shape, and there were plenty of guns left and plenty of men to use them. Midway was wounded, but it was far from crippled, and a long, long way from being dead. This was quite clear to the commander of the Japanese aircraft as he led his planes back to their carriers. He had noted that the airfield runways were still in good enough condition to be used, and that the anti-aircraft fire had been as vicious when his planes were leaving as it had been when they arrived. Obviously, the attack had not been a success. But Midway's defences had to be knocked out before the Japanese troops tried to land, or they would be massacred. The commander sent a radio message to Admiral Nagumo, "Second attack necessary." When Nagumo received that message, it meant he had to make a serious decision. His fleet was in a good, safe situation, with dozens of Zero fighters circling protectively over it, and with a total of 93 torpedo planes and dive bombers sitting on the decks of the carriers, armed and ready to be launched. But if another attack on Midway was needed, it should be made right away, and these planes and the fighters overhead would have to be sent to make it. This meant that with them gone, and the planes that had made the first attack not back yet, the 4 carriers would have no aircraft protection for several hours and would be helpless if attacked by American planes from Midway, should any of them manage to get into the air and past his attacking force. So Nagumo had to decide, should he make a second attack on Midway and risk danger to his carriers, or should he not attack and possibly risk having the whole invasion defeated because Midway's defences were still in good shape. While he was pondering this, sirens signalling an air raid alert began to wail on his ships. Some of the American planes from Midway that he had been concerned about had just arrived 6 United States Navy Grumman Avenger torpedo planes and 4 United States Army B-26 bombers. But this tiny force had no chance at all. The warships that were surrounding Nagumo's carriers in a protective box formation opened up with every anti-aircraft gun they had. They shot 7 of the American planes right out of the sky and sent the other 3 limping off, badly damaged, to crash land on Midway hours later. The result of this pitiful attack was that Nagumo was able to make up his mind about sending the rest of his planes to make a second attack on Midway. His ships had fought off the American planes so easily that the admiral now felt he had nothing to fear from any other planes that might come from the atoll. He ordered a second attack to be made. However, Nagumo had ordered all torpedo planes sitting on the carrier flight decks to be armed with torpedoes just in case any American ships should show up. So before those planes could be sent to Midway, they would have to have their torpedoes replaced with bombs for use on land targets. Crews began hauling the planes onto the huge elevators, where they were carried down to the decks below to have the torpedoes removed and bombs installed. Thus, by about 7:30 a.m. that morning, a good half of Nagumo's planes were disarmed and down off the flight decks, and it would be a long time before they could be rearmed, made ready to fly, and brought back up. And at that moment, Nagumo received another radio message. He really did not think there were any American ships within 1,000 miles or so, but just in case, he had sent out 7 scout planes just after sunrise to look around. None of them had apparently seen anything. However, one of them had been a little late in taking off because of a mechanical problem, and it had just now reached the farthest point of its search area, and there it had seen something. Its message said, "Have seen what appears to be 10 enemy ships in position bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway." Nagumo was thunderstruck. There was an American fleet nearby, and if it included an aircraft carrier, then his own carrier force was in terrible danger of being hit by a heavy air attack at a moment when more than half his planes were down on the hangar decks with their wings folded up and their torpedoes being removed. Nagumo now seemed to become uncertain about what he should do. He ordered the carrier crews to stop removing the torpedoes and to stand by for an air attack against ships instead of against a land base. He sent a message to the scout plane that had sighted the Americans demanding to know what kinds of ships it had seen. Apparently, he felt that he had to find out whether or not any of those ships were carriers before he could decide exactly what to do. Then, as Nagumo paced back and forth on the bridge of his flagship, Akagi, waiting for an answer to his message, something happened that made his problem even more complicated. The rest of the American planes from Midway arrived, and the Japanese fleet came under attack. The Americans came in 3 groups, one after the other, first 16 Marine dive bombers, then 15 United States Army high-level B-26 bombers, then 11 Marine Vindicator bombers, a total of 42 planes. They flew through swarms of the deadly Zero fighters and through hailstorms of machine gun fire and anti-aircraft bursts. Some were shot down before they could even drop their bombs. The others managed to unload their bombs and get away. But in what seemed to be an almost incredible flow of bad luck for the Americans and good luck for the Japanese, not one of the many bombs dropped hit anything. The attack was a total failure. However, it was 8:30 a.m. by the time the last American plane was chased off. The attack had taken nearly a full hour, and during that time the Japanese had not, of course, been able to bring any planes up from the carrier hangar decks to the flight decks. So Admiral Nagumo was actually in a slightly worse predicament than he had been in before the attack began. For one thing, he had finally received the answer he had been awaiting from the scout plane, and it had confirmed his worst fears. The pilot indicated that he thought he had, indeed, seen an aircraft carrier among the American ships. But even though Nagumo now knew without question that there was at least one American carrier within striking distance, there was still nothing he could do. He still could not start bringing planes up onto the carrier decks, because the planes from his Midway attack force were just now beginning to return, and the decks had to be kept clear so they could land. The Japanese carriers were going to continue to be sitting ducks for some time. Desperate with anxiety, Nagumo waited as plane after plane, each nearly out of fuel, came gliding onto its carrier's deck. By 8:45 a.m., he was growing even more anxious, for he was now getting messages from some of the other scout planes, reporting large flights of aircraft heading toward his ships, and he knew what that meant. The American carrier had launched an attack. At 17 minutes past 9, With most of his planes now safely back and covering the decks of their carriers, Nagumo ordered his fleet to change course to a right angle from its original direction. He intended to hide out under some heavy clouds that would conceal his force from the American aircraft while he got all his planes refueled and properly armed. Then he would launch an all-out attack that would cripple the little American fleet and leave it helpless, to be destroyed by the big guns of the battleships of the Japanese main force. Even though the Americans had apparently somehow found out about the Midway invasion, Admiral Yamamoto's plan would still work to crush them. At 7 o'clock, just about the same moment when Admiral Nagumo was trying to decide whether to make a second attack on Midway, the commander of American Task Force 16, Admiral Spruance, was also pondering a difficult decision. Spruance knew the Japanese planes were now returning from the attack on Midway, and if he launched every plane he could right now, they had a good chance of reaching the Japanese fleet just as the Japanese planes were landing on their carriers, which meant the carriers would be helpless. On the other hand, if the American task force had been spotted by Japanese scout planes, a Japanese air attack might be headed toward it this very moment, and with all their planes gone, it was the American carriers that would be defenseless. But Spruance quickly made up his mind to take a daring chance. He ordered every plane that could fly to take off and go after the Japanese fleet. About half an hour later, Task Force 17 joined Spruance's force, and Admiral Fletcher launched about half of Yorktown's planes. Thus, at 9:17 a.m., when Admiral Nagumo ordered his fleet to change course, 151 American planes were streaking toward the part of the ocean where the last Catalina report had said Nagumo's ships could be found. But Nagumo's order to change course had been a smart move that caused the American pilots a good deal of trouble. For, as each American squadron reached the place where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be, it found nothing there. Each squadron commander had to decide immediately which way to go to search for the enemy. The planes from Hornet came toward the position all together, 35 dive bombers and 9 fighters up high, and 15 torpedo planes down low. When the officer leading the bombers and fighters realized the Japanese fleet was not where it was supposed to be, he decided it must have moved closer to Midway, so he led his planes in that direction. Of course, they never found the Japanese ships. The commander of the squadron of low-flying torpedo planes could not see the fighters and bombers turn toward Midway because they were hidden from him by clouds. So when he decided to take his squadron northward the right direction, his 15 planes were all by themselves, with no fighters to protect them and no dive bombers to help them with an attack. Shortly, the torpedo squadron sighted smoke from the stacks of Japanese ships in the distance and turned toward it. They were still miles from the enemy fleet when Zeros began to pounce on them from all sides. Grimly, each pilot tried to twist and weave his way through danger, moving steadily toward the Japanese ships, while each rear gunner tried desperately to fight off the 2 or 3 Zeros clinging to his craft's tail with their guns chattering. Anti-aircraft bursts began to hurl chunks of shrapnel into the torpedo planes and machine gun tracer bullets, leaving long, thin trails of white smoke to show their path, were reaching toward the Americans from all sides. Planes began dropping out of the formation, riddled with bullets, shattered by anti-aircraft fire, burning. All 15 planes of Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8th were shot down, and none of the few torpedoes they managed to launch scored a hit. Only moments after the last of Hornet's torpedo planes went down, Torpedo Squadron 6th, from Enterprise, found the Japanese ships and came buzzing in low over the water to make their attack. But these planes, too, had become separated from their fighters and had no protection from the Zeros. 10 of the 14 planes were destroyed before they could even launch torpedoes. The other 4 managed to launch and then dodge away from the pursuing Zeros, but none of their torpedoes hit anything. By now it was 10 o'clock, and still another squadron of American torpedo planes had appeared. This was Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3. It was accompanied by 6 Wildcat fighter planes, but they were, of course, vastly outnumbered by all the Zeros, and while a few Zeros dealt with them, the rest swarmed over the torpedo planes. Although 7 of the Americans went down in flames, 5 managed to launch before 3 of them were shot down. Once again, however, there were no torpedo hits. The Japanese sailors on the carriers and other ships were jubilant. All morning long they had been fighting off air attacks, first from the Midway planes and now from carriers, and they had not even been scratched. It seemed like incredible good luck and an incredible victory over the attacking Americans, but the good luck was suddenly about to turn very bad. By sheer chance, the seemingly useless torpedo plane attacks had made two things happen. One, during the attacks, the Japanese had not been able to clear the carrier decks of aircraft, and the decks were crowded with planes, just as Admiral Spruance had hoped. And, two, because all the attacks had been launched by torpedo planes flying nearly at sea level, all the Japanese fighter planes had come down low to attack the attackers. There were now no Zeros high overhead. And high overhead, two groups of American Douglas Dauntless dive bombers were racing in toward the Japanese from two directions. One group consisted of two squadrons from Enterprise, which now split up, each squadron heading for a separate Japanese carrier. In moments, 37 dive bombers were screaming down on their targets. There were no enemy fighters nearby to stop them, and hardly any anti-aircraft fire, for most of the Japanese ships had not yet even become aware of the danger dropping upon them. The first three planes that dove at the carrier Kaga missed with their bombs. Then a 1,000-pound bomb went off on Kaga's deck with a searing flash and the impact of a giant fist. The superstructure, the multi-storied, metal-walled housing that sits like a castle at the edge of a carrier's flight deck, became a twisted pile of bent steel plate and broken glass, filled with dead and dying men. Moments later, a second bomb erupted among the planes on the flight deck, hurling them in all directions and ripping a huge hole in the deck. Gasoline, pouring out of the gashed and split tanks of aircraft, caught fire, and a dozen flaming streams went zigzagging across the deck and dripped down through the jagged bomb crater onto the hangar deck below, starting fires there. Two more bombs shattered Kaga's top deck and turned it into a raging sea of flames. The carrier was finished. The carrier being attacked by the 16 planes of the other squadron was Akagi, the flagship of the fleet, upon which Admiral Nagumo had his headquarters. 40 planes sat on its flight deck. They were fueled and armed and ready to be launched for the attack that Nagumo had planned to make against the American fleet, and everyone aboard the ship was watching them make ready to take off. But suddenly, Akagi's crew became aware of another sound, rising over the warm-up rumble of their plane's engines, the shrill, screaming roar of diving aircraft. Heads jerked upward and eyes widened in shock at the sight of the United States Navy helldivers streaking down at them. The first bomb dropped was a near miss that showered Akagi's deck with water. The second struck directly in the center of the flight deck, just behind the elevator on which planes were carried down to or brought up from the hangar deck. Tearing through the flight deck, the bomb burst on the hangar deck, where a quantity of torpedoes had been stored, causing them to explode instantly. The double blast buckled the flight deck overhead, shattered the elevator, and set the hangar deck aflame. Moments later, a second bomb exploded at the rear of the flight deck, hurling planes and men into the sea and starting a raging fire there. Akagi, too, was finished. The stunned and shaken Admiral Nagumo and some of his officers managed to make their way onto a destroyer that came alongside the burning carrier. The other group of dive bombers that had managed to locate the Japanese fleet was the squadron from Yorktown, and this squadron made its attack on the carrier nearest to it, which happened to be Soryu. The American planes came screaming down at the carrier in 3 waves. A 1,000-pound bomb broke through Soryu's flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck with a force that crumpled the carrier's forward elevator and slammed it against the ship's superstructure. A second bomb and then a third exploded on the flight deck, and the whole ship burst into flames. Men with scorched uniforms and blackened skins began leaping into the sea. Within 20 minutes, Soryu's captain ordered the entire crew to abandon ship. The 3 bombing attacks had taken only 2 minutes, but during those 120 seconds, the entire course of the Battle of Midway had changed. Admiral Nagumo's planned huge attack on the American fleet had been snuffed out before it could even get started, and he had lost 3/4 of his carriers and 3/4 of his planes. After completing their attack, the American dive bombers started heading back toward their carriers. Some were shot down before they could get away. Some ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the ocean before they could reach their carrier. But of the 54 planes that had made the attack, 38 got back to let Admirals Fletcher and Spruance know that the Japanese carrier force had been dealt a mortal blow. However, the battle was far from over. The carrier Hiryu had not been seen by any of the American dive bombers because it was a considerable distance away from the other 3 carriers, and it had a full load of planes that were armed, fueled, and ready to launch. When Admiral Nagumo left, the shattered Akagi, command of the Japanese carrier force, temporarily went to blank. the man who was in command of the cruisers and destroyers, Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe, and Abe was determined to strike back at the Americans. He ordered Hiryu's planes to be launched in an attack. By 11 o'clock, 18 of Hiryu's dive bombers and 6 of its fighters were in the air. There were still a few American planes in sight, far in the distance, and the Japanese flight commander simply followed them, knowing they would lead him straight to their carrier. The American planes were from Yorktown, so it was Yorktown that would become the target of the Japanese attack. Of course, both Admirals Fletcher and Spruance knew there was still a Japanese carrier left, and were expecting an attack from it. Both of them had forces of Wildcat fighters patrolling over their carriers. It was a little before noon when Yorktown's patrol planes spotted the wave of enemy aircraft coming toward the ship. The 12 Wildcats scrambled to intercept the Japanese and shot down 10 of the dive bombers. The cruisers and destroyers protecting Yorktown opened up with anti-aircraft fire on the 8 bombers that managed to get through the Wildcats. But even as one bomber was hit and blown apart, it dropped a bomb that burst on Yorktown's flight deck, blowing open a hole and starting a fire on the hangar deck below. A few moments later, a bomb exploded inside one of Yorktown's smokestacks, sending a shower of burning soot throughout the ship and disabling several of the boilers that provided the carrier's power. Then a third bomb exploded below decks, starting more fires. The other bombs dropped were misses. The 8 surviving Japanese planes sped off, leaving Yorktown wounded but not really in bad shape. The fires were quickly put out, but the damage to the boilers caused the ship to lose speed gradually and then come to a full stop, which was noticed by the Japanese pilots. And because fire had damaged the communications system, Admiral Fletcher could no longer use Yorktown as his flagship and had to move onto a cruiser. However, by 2 o'clock that afternoon, Yorktown's engines were working again and the carrier was once more able to move. And it could still put planes in the air. Fighters were sitting on the main deck, being made ready for takeoff, but the Japanese were not through with Yorktown. The surviving Japanese pilots had notified their commander that the American carrier had been damaged and was in trouble. A second wave of planes, 10 Nakajima torpedo planes and 6 Zeros, was coming to try to finish the job. They arrived about 2:30 a.m. 8 Wildcats sped to meet them, and the American ships opened up with anti-aircraft fire. But 4 of the Japanese planes managed to get through the fighters and anti-aircraft barrage and launch their torpedoes. 2 of the torpedoes slammed into the carrier's side and exploded with a sound like thunder. The explosions jammed the ship's rudder, knocked out all electrical power, and blew a hole in the hull that began to let in water. Yorktown started to lean over on its side. By 3 o'clock, the captain gave the order to abandon ship. Even as the sailors were leaving the stricken Yorktown, the decks of Hornet and Enterprise were bustling with activity. Scout planes had located the last Japanese carrier, and Admiral Spruance was now about to launch the heaviest possible attack against it, for as long as it was active and able to launch planes, the 2 remaining American carriers were in serious danger. If Hornet and Enterprise were to get knocked out along with Yorktown, the Americans would lose the battle, lose Midway, and possibly lose the war. So at 3:30 a.m., 24 dive bombers from Enterprise and 16 from Hornet rose from their flight decks to attack Hiryu and destroy it. At exactly 5 o'clock, the Enterprise dive bombers reached Hiryu's position. Aboard Hiryu at that moment, planes were being refueled and rearmed for another attack, while the crew was being given the first meal it had been able to have since dawn. Patrol planes were circling over the carrier, but they apparently did not see the approaching American aircraft, which were coming from the west with the afternoon sun directly behind them, making them almost impossible to spot. The first anyone aboard Hiryu knew of the attack was when they became aware of that terrifying sound of screaming engines that meant diving airplanes. Someone yelled, "Helldivers!" Then the first bomb struck. It tore the forward elevator loose and hurled it into the superstructure, also blasting a huge hole in the flight deck. 3 more bombs burst, and the airplanes being made ready for launching were scattered in all directions, their bombs and torpedoes exploding and gasoline from their shattered tanks bursting into flame. The fires spread with incredible speed and were quickly out of control. When the dive bombers from Hornet arrived, they found Hiryu burning fiercely and shattered beyond any further use. At 10 minutes before 10 o'clock that morning, Admiral Yamamoto, then hundreds of miles away with the main Japanese fleet, had received a message telling him of the loss of the 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Now at 5 minutes to 6 o'clock in the evening, he received another message from Admiral Nagumo. It said, "Bombs hit Hiryu, causing fires." Yamamoto read between the lines and understood that Hiryu was seriously damaged. It was obvious that his advance force no longer had any aircraft carriers. However, Yamamoto believed he still had a chance to turn this stunning defeat into a victory after all. He sent messages to Nagumo, to the admiral in command of the troopships coming from the southwest, to all his submarines, and to the Japanese ships that had gone to the Aleutian Islands, giving orders to surround the American force with many ships and pound it to death with gunfire during the night. But Admiral Spruance, now temporarily in command of the two United States task forces, knew very well that the Japanese would be looking for the American ships during the night, and he had no intention of letting his fleet be found or of fighting an old-fashioned gun battle in darkness with an enemy force that heavily outnumbered and outgunned him. As soon as all of the Hornet and Enterprise dive bombers had returned, he ordered all ships to pull back until they would be out of reach of the Japanese ships, but still in range to launch an air attack in the morning. So as the Japanese ships crept through the darkness that night, searching for the American fleet, they found nothing. By 2:30 in the morning, June 5th, Admiral Yamamoto realized that his whole great plan to destroy the United States Pacific Fleet had failed. He obviously was not going to be able to find the Americans during the night, but if he kept his ships where they were, the Americans would surely find them in the morning, with air attacks. Once again, Yamamoto sent out many messages, calling ships together, turning ships around, pulling the entire Japanese fleet back, retreating. At 5 minutes before 3 o'clock, a last single message went out to all the Japanese ships. Occupation of Midway is cancelled. This was a dreadful blow for all the men of the Japanese fleet, for it meant they had been defeated. And this was the first defeat the modern Japanese Navy had suffered since it had been formed. Admiral Yamamoto sat alone on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, sipping from a bowl of rice soup and staring bitterly into the darkness. This Japanese cruiser Mikuma sank on June 5th after marine planes from Midway attacked. Things were still not quite over for either the Japanese or Americans. During the next 2 days, American search planes sank one Japanese cruiser and badly damaged another, while a Japanese submarine torpedoed and finally sank the still-floating Yorktown, as well as an American destroyer. With that, the Battle of Midway officially came to an end. It was a clear-cut victory for the United States. 4 major Japanese aircraft carriers and 1 cruiser had been sunk, as against 1 American carrier and a destroyer. The American fleet was still in good fighting shape, and Midway was still in American hands. When news of the battle's outcome was released in the United States, with newspaper headlines such as "Japanese smashed at Midway," there was a tremendous uplifting of spirits. This was badly needed, for until then, of course, things had not been going well, either in the Pacific or in Europe. In any war, a great many of the battles that are fought really do not make much of a difference, but the Battle of Midway was what historians call a decisive battle, an action whose outcome actually affects history. If the Japanese had won at Midway, the United States might well have made peace, as the Japanese hoped, and left Japan in control of the Pacific, which would have made the world a rather different place today. But the American victory meant that the war would continue, and this, as many of Japan's admirals and generals realized only too well, meant that Japan was going to lose the longer America stayed in the war, the more war material its enormous industrial power could turn out. For Japan, a long war would be and was a strain its industry could not meet. The loss of the 4 carriers at Midway was a loss the Japanese shipbuilders were never able to make up, whereas the United States shipbuilding industry put 9 new carriers out to sea before the war's end. The Japanese had also lost 322 planes and hundreds of their best, most experienced pilots, and these too could not be replaced. Those pilots were men who could have taught their skills to younger Japanese airmen, and without them, there simply were not enough teachers. As time went on, the men who became Japan's pilots were more and more poorly trained and unable to stand up against the well-trained American flyers, who also began getting planes that were equal to, and better than, the Japanese Zero fighter. In Japan, the news of the defeat was largely withheld from the Japanese people, but it threw many of the top military leaders into deep gloom. During the months of Japanese victories before Midway, plans had been made to make more major invasions, but with the Navy now crippled by the loss of those 4 carriers, and with the American fleet still able to give a good accounting for itself, any such invasion attempts would be far too dangerous. After 6 straight months of successful offense, Japan suddenly found itself on the defensive, wondering what the Americans would now do. What the American and Allied leaders intended to do was to go on the offensive for the first time since the beginning of the war. Thus, though no one really realized it at the time, the Battle of Midway was the turning point of the war in the Pacific. From now on, things would be completely different. It would be the Americans who would aggressively take the offensive, and the Japanese who would have to defend themselves desperately.